Hello, thank you for joining with me. We are on day 25, Cameo 11, the notes on sex, and I'm reading with the Course Companions book led by Emily Bennington, and Robert Perry participates, and that's on Facebook. I'm going to go ahead and start with a prayer if you'd like to close your eyes and join me. Dear God, please enable me to set aside everything I think I know about A Course in Miracles, Helen Schuckman, myself, others, you. God, please allow me to have an open mind and a new experience with A Course in Miracles, Helen Schuckman, myself, you, and everyone else, and you, God. God, open my eyes to help me to see the truth as you would have me see it. I love you. Thank you. All right. Cameo 11. We're in Appendix 1 at 1749. After she had received a lengthy discourse on sex, and that's the Miracle Principle 46 in Chapter 1, Helen paused to express her doubts about the validity of the material she had taken down. Bill, I got very uneasy here and thought maybe I was just writing all this, which has been very time-consuming and quite irksome at times, because I was jealous. I'm still not sure I need your help about this, but I went on anyway because it did not seem finished. Please help me evaluate it because I don't want scribal areas to enter too much into the course, though I guess they'll be corrected when they do. What do you think about all this? I hadn't intended to write a commentary on sex. See the star above. See asterisk. Sorry, I said star. I don't think I'm clear on that. Anyway, maybe you are. It just occurred to me that the doubt may come from something I don't want to give up. Should I tell you about it? It's kind of embarrassing, really. But I just remembered the One More River with which this started. The recent discussions of sex began with Tell Bill the One More River is related to sex. All quotations without page numbers in this cameo are from Helen's notes. Throughout these cameo essays, we have corrected spelling errors in the notes for ease in reading. I'm sorry. Yet, on the... oh, I didn't even get all that. Sorry. Helen's sincerity is unmistakable. She is completely transparent here in her uncertainty and self-questioning. Her desire to keep the course free of her influence and her appeal to Bill for help. On the one hand, she suspects that all of this commentary on sex is just bubbling up of her own jealousy in relation to Bill ? Yet, on the other hand, the material seems to have a life of its own, like the pages in this book. Just kidding. I hadn't intended to write a commentary on sex, making it seem as if it's coming from beyond her. She just can't discern where the material is coming from, and so she's asking Bill to help her to sort it out. Students of A Course in Miracles have been gripped by this same question since 2000, when the Urtext became public, and along with it, the notes on sex. Since this material is absent from the familiar FIP version, the presence of it in the Urtext came as quite a surprise. Students faced a crucial question. Is this material valid, or is it a product of Helen's biases? Little did they know that Helen had faced this same question before they did. The first discussion of sex comes quite early, just after Miracle Principle 18. This fairly brief discourse, 260 words, is the foundation for what comes after. It announces many of the main themes that are repeated later and is then referenced twice in later discussions. I told you before that many are born who have not been reborn. We said before that all real pleasure comes from doing God's will. Helen seems to have had problems with this first discussion. As soon as it was done, she says, "This upsets me." Jesus' response is telling. "Sometimes I can't get through anyway." The implication seems to be that even though Helen was upset about what he was teaching her, he wanted to get this teaching on sex through anyway. Helen, however, chose not to dictate this first discourse to Bill to include in the your text. It stayed in her notebooks. Yet now that further teachings on sex have been given, Helen's brief comment about being upset has mushroomed into full-blown doubts about what has now become a miniature treatise. Yet it is important that she expresses her doubts so openly, for doing so evokes an answer. First, she herself suspects the resolution. She wonders if she is doubting the material because of something I don't want to give up. This is associated with her remembering Bill's slip about one more river, which Jesus commented on as he began this whole discourse on sex. Tell Bill the one more river is related to sex. As is discussed in Cameo 8, the one more river seems to have been the one more thing standing between Bill and his release. By referencing Bill's slip and Jesus' identification of it as related to sex, Helen seems to be saying that something similar is going on with her. She suspects, in other words, that she has an attachment related to sex which is keeping her from seeing the truth of this material. These suspicions are suggestive, but what really answers her doubts is a comment from Jesus. There is a stray notebook page which is found over 150 pages later in her notebooks, but which must have been misplaced because it is clearly the answer to her question. You will recall that she had, that was my dog. You will recall that she said, "I hadn't intended to write a commentary on sex." Then after that she wrote, see asterisk above. The asterisk is clearly a reference to this exchange on that stray notebook page. This morning I was slightly corrected by Jesus to read, "God knows I hadn't intended to write a commentary on sex." Answer: He does indeed. The meaning of this correction from Jesus hits one immediately on an intuitive level. Helen's original comment, "I hadn't intended to write a commentary on sex," already suggested the possibility that the impetus for this dictation came from beyond her. Now Jesus' corrected version intensifies that. He has Helen say, "God knows I hadn't intended to write a commentary on sex." And then he answers, "He does indeed." This clearly frames God as the knowing one in the process and Helen as the innocent channel. Think of how you would interpret a similar statement about something you did. If, for example, you said, "God knows I hadn't intended to buy A Course in Miracles at the bookstore that day," and Jesus then responded, "He does indeed," you would have no doubt of the point of Jesus' remark. Jesus' correction, then, is an unmistakable answer to Helen's doubts about this material. As such, it is extremely important. It settles this whole question of the validity of the teachings on sex. It is also part of a pattern. It is in line with the suspicions Helen herself voices here, that her doubts about the material may come from something I don't want to give up. It is also similar to the brief exchange she had with Jesus after the first discourse on sex, where she had said, "This upsets me," and he said, "Sometimes I can get through anyway." In both that case and this, we have a discourse on sexuality followed by Helen voicing discomfort, followed by Jesus framing the discourse as coming from beyond her. Helen's discomfort with this material, however, apparently did not go away. With each editing pass, she took more of it out until there was essentially nothing left. Some of the teaching on sexuality in her notes did not even make it into the year text, including that foundational discourse after Miracle Principle 18. By the time we get to the Hugh Lynn Casey version, often called the HLC, the version prior to the FIP First Edition, what was originally 3,300 words on sex have been cut down to about 300. And even in this, the word sexual has been replaced with the more general physical. As a result, the original approximately 60 references to cognates of the word sex, such as sex, sexual, psychosexual, have been reduced to a single aside. The confusion of sex with aggression serves as an example. Finally, even the brief amount that remains in the HLC is mostly removed from the FIP edition, which does not contain a single reference to the word sex. Many students assume that this I'm having a hard time. Many students assume that this material was taken out because Helen saw it as inconsistent with the latter teaching of the course. Yet, in Appendix 2, we see that Helen's editing focused on stylistic concerns, not on theoretical consistency. She herself said, "I assume the attitude of an editor whose role is to consider only form and disregard content as much as possible." And that's 3, Absence from Felicity, 316. As we see in Appendix 2, her editing showed an across-the-board bias against specifics, so that references to concrete phenomena in the world were either removed or reworded as to be more general. And that is exactly what we find here. References to the concrete phenomenon of sex were either removed or made more general by changing sexual to physical. Further, Helen seemed to be particularly uncomfortable with the sex discussions, as she states in her notes, giving her even more motivation to remove it. Helen's general editing tendencies, along with her specific discomfort with this topic, then, give us all the explanation we need to understand why this material was removed. Is this material inconsistent with the later course? Rather than making hasty assumptions, this is a question that needs to be carefully examined. In this examination, what is specifically striking are the many parallels between the early teachings on sex and the later course teaching on special relationships in the body. The early teaching that sexual pleasure is not truly pleasurable in itself is mirrored by the Course's later teaching that physical pleasure is ultimately painful, for it identifies with the body. The early teaching is that the early teaching that in sex we view another as a sex object is mirrored in the later criticism that in romantic relationships we view others as mindless bodies. For relationships to the ego mean only that bodies are together, and it does not object where the mind goes or what it thinks, for this seems unimportant. And that's in the text, chapter 15. The early teaching that sex is not for achieving closeness, you have misunderstood sex because you regard it as a way of establishing human contact for yourself, is mirrored in the later teaching that sexual union does not establish real closeness. The union of bodies thus becomes the way in which you would keep minds apart. The early teaching that sexual attraction itself must be undone, the underlying mechanism must be uprooted, is mirrored in the later idea that we must get beyond attraction to bodies, when the body ceases to attract you. Finally, the practical instructions for dealing with sexual attraction and fantasy are strikingly similar in both the early dictation and the later course. In chapter 1 of the text, we are told that in a situation where you experience inappropriate sex impulses, you should invite Jesus to enter, and then he will replace it, the sexual attraction, with love. In chapters 16 and 17, we are told that whenever your thoughts wander to a special relationship which still attracts you, you should allow Jesus to enter and step between you and your fantasies, and then the Holy Spirit will release you from your sexual attraction. The pattern could hardly be more similar. Like Helen, we may find this material uncomfortable, but the evidence that the author of the Course genuinely intended it is sizable. Okay. We may find it uncomfortable, but the evidence that the author of the Course genuinely intended it is sizable. For one, there is the sheer length of it, 3,300 words woven throughout the foundational material. Miracles are not to be dismissed lightly. There's also the emphasis on it. At one point, Jesus says, I want to finish the instructions about sex because this is an area which the miracle worker must understand. Then there is the fact that Jesus never corrected any of it. At this early point in the dictation, he would sometimes tell Helen to correct something she had misheard. She even references this in her comments above. I don't want scribal errors to enter too much into the Course, though I guess they'll be corrected when they do, yet none of the material on sex was ever corrected. On the contrary, as we saw when Helen wondered if Jesus should correct these notes, he stepped in instead to correct her doubts. This was important not only to put these doubts to rest, but because he wasn't finished. Over 40% of the material on sex was still to be dictated. Finally, as we saw above, there are strong echoes of these notes later on in the Course. The later Course is teaching on physical pleasure, treating others as physical objects, the union of bodies, physical attraction, and the prescriptions for dealing with sexual attraction and fantasy are all markedly similar to the early teachings on sex. There comes a point at which, regardless of any discomfort on our end, we just need to step aside and let the author do what he wants to do with his book. It is, after all, his book. That point has clearly been reached in the case of the notes on sex. When we first started editing this version, we had a different plan. We corralled all the material on sex in one place, cut it down to less than 2,000 words, and moved it from chapter 1 to chapter 2. That way, rather than being hit with it repeatedly throughout the very first chapter, the reader would encounter just one little fenced off area in chapter 2. Sorry, I have a dog trying to get attention. Get down, honey. However, we eventually recognized that what we were doing, we were attempting to override the author's wishes for his own book. We have therefore included the discourses on sex and have left them in their original order and placement. Great idea. All right. The notes on sex, Cameo 11. Thank you for joining with me. I love you. Oh yeah, let's read this. Cameo 11, the notes on sex. The commentary for today is from Robert Perry. Being the author of the Cameo itself, it makes sense to use his words here versus mine. The basic idea in this cameo is that Jesus wants us to be miracle workers. This means allowing what he calls the miracle drive to flow up from deep in our unconscious mind and become expressed through our actions. To be miracle workers, that miracle drive has to be what drives us. It has to be our driving influence. But what happens, Jesus says, is that this drive, as it flows toward consciousness, gets distorted by our identification with the body. As a result, it becomes twisted, honey, my dogs. It becomes twisted, converted into something else entirely. And that, of course, is the sex drive. So now, what were impulses to give miracles become sexual impulses. The impulse to join with the mind, a person, has become the impulse to join with the body, an object. And these are more than isolated impulses. He says that miracles and sex are both ways of relating. So now our whole way of relating becomes sexually based, or at the very least, strongly sexually influenced, rather than miracle inspired. What happens when the miracle drive becomes cooped? Is that cooped? All right. What happens when the miracle drives becomes coopted, converted into something else? What happens when the miracle drive becomes coopted, converted into something else? The answer hardly needs to be said. We don't express the miracle drive, but rather the something else. And if the miracle drive is the source of us functioning as miracle workers, then we know what has happened to that function. And so Jesus ends up empty-handed. His potential miracle workers are all off doing something else. There is another way to look at this issue based on our recent reading in the text. Jesus wants us to cultivate and maintain a state of miracle-mindedness as the basis for our miracle doing. This state is impersonal. It regards everyone as the same. Everyone is our brother. Everyone matters. Everyone is deserving. This impersonal state of mind, because it gives everyone equal weight, can then be channeled in the form of particular miracles wherever Jesus wants it to be. As I wrote the other day, it's only when we love everyone that we can give miracles to anyone. But if our way of relating is sexually based, that impersonal state of mind is absent. We have a very uneven playing field in which some are greatly favored and others entirely overlooked, all based on whether their body pleases our body. This extreme mental favoritism is exactly the opposite of miracle-mindedness. Now, when Jesus says, give a miracle to Mary, our mind says, Mary who? I'd rather give my attention to the cute one. Either way you slice it, you can see how the whole function into which he is trying to lead us is undone by a sexually oriented way of relating. And that is that. Those are the notes on sex, and these were comments by Robert Perry. And I think I may have missed a... That's it. Tomorrow we will be back in the text. Thank you so much for joining with me. I love you. Thank you for tolerating my mistakes and my